Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. We're taking a look back at the biggest media story of last year, one that the source of the story, Edward Snowden, called the largest program of suspicionless surveillance in human history. By now, you know the details of how a contractor for the U.S. National Security Agency, the NSA, blew the whistle on the program, its scope and scale, how America eavesdropped on alleged allies, the high-tech tunnels into the data banks of Silicon Valley giants who played ball with the NSA, and the metadata sweeps that took in the private communications of millions of citizens around the world. By getting the story to Glenn Greenwald, who was working for the UK's Guardian newspaper at the time, Snowden slowly drip-fed details on NSA surveillance in country after country through carefully selected media outlets in Germany, France, and Brazil, among many others. Snowden, who gave up a job in Hawaii and a six-figure salary for a life on the run, has yet to come in from the cold. He's lying low in wintry Moscow, but according to the journalists involved, this story is far from complete. There are more secret documents, more revelations coming. In the second half of this program, we'll be speaking to a former NSA lawyer who says Edward Snowden should go to jail for what he did. But first, a retrospective on the Snowden story, how it came out, and how it played out in the media. Our starting point, the adopted home of American journalist Glenn Greenwald, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil.
I had been contacted in December 2012 by someone who didn't identify himself, but said that he had what he called interesting material that he thought I would want to look at. So I asked him to just provide me with a sample. He sent me through encrypted email maybe 24 top secret documents, and I immediately knew this was one of the most significant national security leaks in history. I had been working on surveillance issues for many years and had been writing about the abuses of the NSA, and suddenly in my lap had dropped some of the most potent instruments for shining a light on what it is that they were doing beyond your wildest dreams as a journalist. The unprecedented nature of the documents was going to be a huge earthquake in the political and media landscape around the world. And then the next call I made was to my editor because I knew I needed to get the Guardian behind it in a very fast way.
June 5th, 2013, the day Edward Snowden blew the whistle on the NSA. First, The Guardian reported on a secret FBI order backed up by a court requiring Verizon and other American mobile providers to hand over metadata, logs for all domestic cell phone calls in the U.S. and to numbers overseas. The next day, June 6th, The Washington Post told the world about PRISM, a huge, all-encompassing email dragnet, a data mining tool so sweeping that the agency's own documents and diagrams called it the NSA's #1 source of raw intelligence. And the NSA wasn't the only organization with some explaining to do. Other intelligence agencies, MI5 and GCHQ in Britain, and the Googles, Yahoos, and Verizons, who all opened their doors to the NSA at the expense of their customers' privacy and security, had their feet put to the fire. All of those stories, and more to come, came from just one source, one leak.
What we have learned from this massive outpouring of documents is just how secret surveillance operations in the United States have been under all of these new laws and new authorities that have passed, and the extent to which the government has kind of taken free rein and what they believe that they can do under the language that has been put into place.
So to me, Snowden has kind of like lifted the tent flap to look inside of a system, but I'm not sure that the size of his revelations matches our understanding of what that system is, nor necessarily what we should do about it.
The first wave of reporting in the U.S. media did do some of that, but there was also the inevitable focus on the personal side of the story. Just who was Edward Snowden?
He never graduated from high school.
High school dropout.
A 29-year-old kid just throwing open the safe.
Oftentimes, when the media are attacked by politicians or their officials, journalists plead, "Don't shoot the messenger." On the Snowden story, journalists who usually act as messengers were shooting the new messenger, Snowden, and the reporter he was working with, Glenn Greenwald.
It's a very bad reflection on Washington journalism. This was a gift to them, basically, by Edward Snowden and The Guardian. And you can see before the Snowden leaks, how much did they spend looking into what NSA was doing? They did almost nothing. So it's the age-old mainstream media anger that somebody else is getting a story that they should have gotten a long time ago.
Why shouldn't you, Mr. Greenwald, be charged with a crime?
David Gregory on Meet the Press, he adopted the language of the politician in a way that was unhelpful.
I think it's pretty extraordinary that anybody who would call themselves a journalist would publicly muse about whether or not other journalists should be charged with felonies.
Greenwald is doing what any good journalist would be doing. He was given materials, he reported the materials, he investigated the materials, he's put them out there. He is not aiding and abetting any kind of violation of the Espionage Act.
What do you think of Edward Snowden?
I think he's a traitor.
I was annoyed that so much of the attention was on Snowden and not on the issues of what he was leaking. But the truth of the matter is that it has sustained attention enough for there to be a story beyond Edward Snowden, and the story is beyond Edward Snowden. And that does show some wisdom behind the strategy that those who have access to the documents are employing.
That strategy has seen Glenn Greenwald turn to selected news outlets outside the United States with the Snowden material and have those outlets publish stories of what the NSA had been up to in their countries. Within the space of 3 days in October, Le Monde in Paris reported on the agency monitoring the calls of millions of citizens, including France's political and corporate elite. Then Der Spiegel revealed that Chancellor Merkel's phone may have been tapped, as well as that of the Mexican president, Enrique Peña Nieto. Before that, Greenwald went on Globo TV in Brazil to report on President Dilma Rousseff being spied on by Washington. When journalists get exclusives, most keep the material to themselves and publish their scoops in one outlet. Greenwald and his colleague Laura Poitras did the opposite, choosing their partners like Der Spiegel carefully, tactically, to maximize the impact.
When we first started digging into that material, we thought that, well, if you see the surveillance on the European Union, we thought like, wow, that's already a big thing. Then we saw the United Nations surveillance, and we thought even the United Nations. Then we had the spying on the Mexican government, and we were like, this as well. And the definite highlight of this whole thing has been that the NSA spied on the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, which is in a way insane because Germany has been a very close friend to the United States.
Every few days, new documents are coming out and we're learning more and more about the programs. And what this has effectively done for the public is keep issues of privacy, keep issues of surveillance right in front of them. So now they're more aware of how commercial entities are using their information, where it's flowing across the internet. So it's just been a massive increase across the board in awareness of privacy and information flows.
When we approached the White House in the very beginning, we received emails like, White House has no time this week to discuss this matter. We were like, wow, the White House has no time to discuss the surveillance of the European Union? Are you serious?
The Obama White House was already under attack over the issue of whistleblowers, the growing American security state, and the keeping of secrets. The administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers under the Espionage Act than all previous presidential administrations combined. It had already tacitly admitted that its Justice Department had gone too far when it tapped the phones of the Associated Press over one leaked story and called a Fox News reporter a criminal co-conspirator in another leaked case on the Iran nuclear issue. The White House's obsession with secrecy and its unprecedented pursuit of whistleblowers had American journalists and press freedom activists worrying about a chilling effect on sources. What Edward Snowden did, blowing the whistle in a big way and revealing his identity, if not his precise location, happened despite that chill.
There's a very big need for journalists to have access to whistleblowers. I mean, the only alternative is to allow the government agencies to keep everything as secret as they want. And what happens when you do that is you have the warrantless eavesdropping, where the NSA is getting secret access to information without any kind of legal authority. So you really need the intervention of journalists to make independent decisions on some of this information.
There has also been a lot of discussion about whether the journalists should give up all of the technology that we have and go back to meeting people in the park over a cigarette or in a parking garage to exchange information, and that they should not be using cell phones or any of this, because that all is collectible and perhaps being collected.
Yet here in Washington, I'm hearing increasingly that Snowden has created, in fact, a significant change on the part of those in government, that they themselves don't have a full understanding of what the intelligence community is up to. It's not whether Obama knew or didn't know. It's not whether or not Alexander, as head of the NSA, knew or didn't know, but people really admit now that the system has become so large that nobody really understands it completely.
Have you been contacted by the FBI?
For all the huffing and puffing on the U.S. airwaves about the prosecution of journalists, Glenn Greenwald and those at the New York Times and Washington Post who have reported on the Snowden files are protected. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of the press. There is no such protection in Britain, the home base of The Guardian. The paper's editor, Alan Rusbridger, was called before a parliamentary committee and was grilled about patriotism and journalism.
I love this country. Do you love this country? I'm slightly surprised to be asked the question, but yes.
Andrew Parker, the head of MI5, the UK's domestic spy agency, said The Guardian's reporting hands the advantage to the terrorists. It is the gift they need to evade us and strike at will. When the committee tried to get Parker to testify to back that up with evidence, he simply refused to appear. Right-wing papers, which style themselves as protectors of individual rights in the UK and opponents of government overreach, were less critical of what the Cameron government is doing than they were about The Guardian reporting it. And Glenn Greenwald's partner was taken into custody at London's Heathrow Airport and held for 11 hours under the UK's Terrorism Act because he was carrying USB files containing encrypted copies of the Snowden material.
It's not going to stop our reporting. It doesn't do them any good. All it did, as I said this week, is give them a huge black eye in the world, make them look thuggish and authoritarian.
2013 ended with 2 court rulings on the NSA. A New York judge sided with the agency. Another in D.C. said it almost certainly breached Americans' right to privacy. Those cases are destined for the Supreme Court. And the refugee appeared on Britain's Channel 4 to deliver a Christmas message from Moscow.
The conversation occurring today will determine the amount of trust we can place both in the technology that surrounds us and the government that regulates it. Together, we can find a better balance, end mass surveillance, and remind the government that if it really wants to know how we feel, asking is always cheaper than spying.
And as 2014 began, The Guardian and the New York Times published editorials calling on the White House to give the whistleblower clemency and a way home. After all the revelations, allegations, and recriminations conducted in the televised court of public opinion, Edward Snowden starts his 7th month in exile with a measure of vindication. Our Global Village voice is now on the NSA surveillance story, the revelations and the journalism.
Pretty clear, given the scale of the mass surveillance system, that there is a huge issue that needs to be discussed both in America and in Britain. A number of members of parliament basically threatened to throw the head of a newspaper in jail for publishing material that he thought, in part of his duty as a journalist, was in the manifest public interest. Compare that experience to the experience that the big 3 heads of Britain's intelligence agencies had before the Intelligence Select Committee in Britain. It was nothing even approaching a real debate.
For so many years, Glenn Greenwald has toiled away at the margins, so to speak, of journalism. It wasn't until the Snowden leaks and his responsible, comprehensive coverage of those leaks that the rest of the world began to accept that kind of journalistic ambition and ardor. The corporate media is under a stranglehold. a stranglehold of self-censorship. Glenn Greenwald is finding a way to get around that.
When President Obama went on the record saying he welcomed the debate on surveillance and security, he was speaking for the White House, not for American intelligence agencies. Stewart Baker knows those agencies from the inside out. Baker spent 2 years as the general counsel to the NSA, advising spy masters there on legal issues. Subsequently, he became Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Stewart Baker is an almost unapologetic supporter of what intelligence agencies do in the name of national security, and he sees Edward Snowden as the bad guy in this story. I spoke to him from Washington, D.C. Stewart Baker, thanks for joining us here at the Listening Post today.
Glad to.
You're a proponent of what the NSA has done on surveillance and think that it should continue fundamentally. But let's start with the media side of this story. Should, as some people have suggested, Glenn Greenwald and The Guardian be prosecuted for bringing the Edward Snowden story to light?
In the U.S., I don't think that's a reasonable prospect. I can't speak as to what British law might permit, but in the U.S., I think the accommodation we've reached with the press is that Snowden can be prosecuted, but prosecuting the press for publishing what he's released is not something we're likely to do.
Why are so many people calling for U.S. authorities to move against Greenwald or against The Guardian, the newspaper that initially published his findings?
I haven't seen a lot of that, to tell the truth. People are unhappy, and Greenwald is clearly an ideologue who's using this material to cause the maximum possible damage to the U.S. But he is a journalist. It's hard to argue with that. And he is publishing it in reputable journals. He's acting, I think, by his own lights, responsibly and withholding certain kinds of information. So he's not the equivalent of an enemy agent.
One of the reasons that Edward Snowden is said to have gone to The Guardian as opposed to the New York Times is because back in 2005, the New York Times held back a story that it had on warrantless wiretapping. It held that story back at the request of the Bush administration until after the 2006 elections. You were at the Department of Homeland Security during that period. Do you think that might be why Snowden was resistant to approach the New York Times or the Washington Post, for that matter?
2006 I was. I can guarantee you the New York Times would not hold a story because it would help President Bush get elected. I think if that's your implication, you're just wrong.
Well, it's not my implication. It's apparently the conclusion that was drawn by Edward Snowden, the source of this story.
Okay, well, he may believe that.
You clearly don't. You remain a supporter of what the NSA is doing on surveillance, though?
Broadly, yes.
Well, do you think that the agency and the administration have done a good enough job in explaining to the American people why it is that they're doing what they've done?
I don't think they have done as good a job as they could, and that's partly, as I said, I think the president really blames the agency for the embarrassment that he has suffered and is therefore a little disinclined to give it full support. But broadly speaking, I think the agency has been left to defend itself, or the intelligence community has been left to defend itself, and they've had a little bit of difficulty doing that, since almost everything they want to say is itself classified, and deciding how much they can declassify is a pretty painful process.
Isn't the other part of the NSA's problem, though, fundamentally that its argument comes down to two words: trust us. And those were the same words that the intelligence community was using before the Iraq War. Trust us. Saddam's got weapons of mass destruction. Trust us. He's with Al-Qaeda. Isn't that the NSA's fundamental problem? This has come down to a two-word argument: trust us, that more and more Americans are simply not willing to buy.
Well, I'm not sure that I accept your notion that everybody's unwilling to buy it, but I think that is a debate we're having. It is not a question of trusting NSA. Since the 1970s, the United States, uniquely among nations, has built an entire structure of law to govern the way it gathers intelligence and put legal limits on what the intelligence community can do, and then put in place judicial oversight, congressional oversight. So the real question is, are you going to trust anyone in government to make decisions of this kind? In the long run, I think the American people are pretty practical, and they'll see that they can't have the New York Times report on every intelligence operation in advance so we can decide whether we're comfortable with it, because of course then they'll never succeed.
Well, there's the other part of this. U.S. government departments regularly leak for reasons that are strategic and political. You know this. You live in Washington, D.C. That city leaks like a sieve.
Yes.
So here's the thing. Oftentimes what is leaked by the administration is actually classified at a much higher level of secrecy than what unofficial leakers like Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden are being prosecuted for. This doesn't seem like a level playing field. So how do you square those two ideas? Leaks for reasons of political expedience versus leaks that some people think have been made in order for Americans to better understand what they think Americans should in fact know.
This is not just a drip of leaks. This is a hemorrhage of practically every classified program that the National Security Agency has operated. There is a problem, and there should be prosecution of people who leak for political reasons. This administration has been remarkably aggressive in pursuing leaks that were put forward for political reasons. But I don't think that there's any equivalence between that and what Snowden and Manning has done.
Another thing that you wrote on your blog was the United States can't stop gathering intelligence without running the risk of terrible surprises, so it won't. Now, no one's suggesting a full stop to U.S. intelligence gathering, just to stop it when it goes too far. The way you frame it, either we do it or we don't do it. But there's got to be a middle ground where enough intelligence can be gathered to protect Americans without knowing where every email is going or every cell phone call is made. Is it really all or nothing in your view? Is that really how you see it?
I'm pretty skeptical that you can decide in advance when you've got enough intelligence and when you don't. Obviously, you made reference to Iraq. Despite extraordinary efforts to gather intelligence, the U.S. government did not have enough intelligence about WMD in Iraq. And so the idea that a little less would be fine, I think, is probably incorrect. But the United States does try to maintain a capability to make itself felt anywhere Al-Qaeda might be. And that means we've got to be prepared to gather intelligence anywhere in the world very quickly. And that means you've got to have capabilities, even if you're not using them, even if you're not sure today that it's important to gather intelligence in Yemen. It may become very important tomorrow. And the idea that you would say, oh, well, Yemen, we just won't gather intelligence there, may turn out to be one of the terrible surprises that we talked about in the article.
Even people who were initially supportive of the NSA over this are now going after the agency. You've written that President Obama seems genuinely embarrassed and unwilling to defend the National Security Agency. Is that because what the agency had been up to is simply indefensible? What do you think is motivating the president?
I actually think it's more deep-seated in his personality. He's not someone who really likes people to see deep into his personality. He likes his secrets. He prefers to be a private person, and in this case, I think he was quite happy to receive secrets about other leaders, but to be exposed as having engaged in this activity is really personally embarrassing to him. It strips away some secrecy that he valued. So I think it's more personal than ideological. It's hard for me to believe that he didn't understand that there was quite a bit of intelligence gathering going on aimed at the other leaders that he was meeting with. But it is pretty embarrassing to have that on the front page of the newspaper.
President Obama did say in the early days after the first revelations in The Guardian that he welcomed a debate on surveillance in America in 2013. Think he really meant that?
No.
Stewart Baker, thanks very much for speaking to us today.
All right. Great to talk to you.
You've been watching a special edition of our program. Next week, we're back to the usual format, examining the global media, old and new. We'll see you then here at The Listening Post.